Today, in the third episode, I have Denis Ledoux as a memoir coach, author, and founder of the Memoir Network. He's best known for his book, Turning Memories into Memoir, which provides practical advice on how to craft compelling personal narratives. With decades of experience as a writer, editor, and writing coach, Denis has guided countless memoirists. Welcome, Denis.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you.
Can we start your story? Where are you from? What you used to do? How did you get into writing memoirs? And what made you become a memoir coach?
Okay, I'm from Maine in the United States. I live a mile from my childhood home, so I have the opportunity to drive by the source of many of my childhood memories. I studied English at the university as an English literature major, and then I became a high school teacher, and did that for a number of years, and it wasn't really. I always tried to be a good high school teacher, but I was a B plus teacher. I wasn't an A plus, and I knew it. But I always tried my best,
Mm-hmm.
but it just wasn't my spirit. And then at one point, I had been writing for a while, and I put out a collection of short stories. And the collection of short stories was What Became of Them and Other Stories from Franco-America. Franco-America refers to the Canadians who came down, Francophone, French-speaking Canadians who came down into New England. And when the book came out, I was asked to speak to a group of older people. Actually, they're younger than I am now, but they were older then to me. And so the director of the program called the foster grandparents, and she asked me if I would come in, and she said that we have a lot of Franco-Americans here, but we also have people who are Jewish and Polish and whatever. And she said, I'm sure the idea would resonate with them to have stories which evoke the past. I just remember standing there, the door was closed, and I could hear sounds inside. And I thought, here goes. I don't know what this is going to add up to. And actually, it added up to my future. It added up to the rest of my working life, really. It reminded me of a friend who said, the most important thing you can do in your career. And I said, no, what? And he said, your very next job, your very next gig. And he said, you never know what it will lead to. So you go ahead and give it your best effort. And that day I did. I gave it my best effort. I read from my stories and I said where they came from. This character is based on my grandmother and this character is based on an uncle, that kind of stuff. And so then I said, can you tell me your stories? And there was this outpouring of stories. The director said, we have to put an end to this. And then she asked me if I would come to another venue and in another venue. So finally, when she asked me for the third one, I said, I think we've got something going here because these people in the different foster grandparent venues had heard about it. And they asked her if I would come. And I said, let's write a grant. So then we did write a grant, and I organized the Turning Memories into Memoirs workshops. And I had a grant. Then I was invited to resubmit the grant, and we almost tripled the size of the grant.
Whoa.
And then after a couple of years of doing that, I was on my own, so I decided to continue doing the workshops. After about 4 years of teaching the workshops, I put together what I knew that was successful, and I created the book, Turning Memories into Memoirs. That has since sold 35,000 copies. I'm very pleased with my flagship book. It's the book that really created what I stood on for years. In one of my workshops, somebody came up and said, the reason I came to the workshop is I really want you to edit my book. I don't particularly want to take the workshop. I just want editing, and I wanted to see if you were legit.
Mhm.
And so it became my first editing. I continued doing the workshops and added coaching at one point. The workshops, you do it to a large group. Coaching is you work with one, or sometimes I did group coaching, which I had 2 or 3 or 4 people together, and we
Mhm.
would have regular sessions. But it was the workshops in miniature. As somebody who started off as a high school teacher, I have a master's in education. There was something in me that loved to teach, but I was not good at high school teaching. And it's the old idea of you've got to find your audience. You've got to find the people that you're good with. And when I
Mhm.
started doing the Turning Memories workshop, and I had all these people ahead of me, they were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and much older. I was the age of their children at that point. Um, and I remember thinking, these are my people. And it was like coming home. I was so happy. And I was with a brand new career. So I had workshops, I had editing, I had coaching. And then
Mhm.
over the years, I produced other books and programs.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about those. So you mentioned your Franco-American book. Tell us what other books have you written and a little bit about them.
I've written a series of books. One of them is called the Memoir Writing Series. So they're how to start your book, how to keep your book going, how to finish your book.
Mhm.
It's got 7 books, 6 books, and they all deal with different topics.
Mhm.
Um, I have one that does well. It's how to start your memoir, and almost anytime I go to speak, somebody wants it.
That's
Um,
we're going to tap into your knowledge from that book.
I also
Memoirs.
had a book called Photoscribe: How to Write the Stories Behind Your Photographs,
That's
and that one,
also of
that,
interest. Mm.
yes, that one was a wonderful for me. It was a wonderful story. One day, I read in a newspaper that a woman was presenting a workshop.
Mhm.
Just had a sense that this woman was not the originator of that workshop. It felt like a press release with a tag on about this particular person. And I looked up, I got a number of an organization. I spoke to somebody. I was really interested in how do you franchise a workshop, which I subsequently did and
Mm.
attracted several hundred teachers who taught the memoir workshops. I got invited to the National Convention of Creative Memories.
Right.
I spoke to a large group, and that first year I sold $5,000 books. They invited me the next year, and it was amazing. I thought I was in writer heaven. I sold $29,000 of books. It was exciting. Over the years, I published a number of books, and then in 2014, I published my mother's memoir. So in starting, I don't know, about 2007, 8,
Mhm.
I collecting my mother's stories just very quietly, like a spy in her life. And I would say, "Tell me about this. Tell me about that." So I was writing her stories. And then at one point, I said to her, "I'm going to write your memoir." And she said, "Oh, there's nothing to say." And I said, "Let me be the judge of that." And she was a little resistant at first because then I began to really probe. Like you said this, and then you said A, and then you said C. What's B in between? How did you go from A to C? And she really grew to love the process. And then when the book came out in 2014, and I presented it to her, it's 208 pages. And she said, "Oh my, what did you find to say about my life for 208 pages?" But she really loved it, and she had
Mhm.
it. She
Mhm.
was in an assisted living facility at the end,
Mhm.
and she had the book on a dresser,
Mhm.
and people come in, and she would sell the book. She was a saleswoman, and, she would call up and say, "I always had 5 copies," and
Mhm.
she'd say, "I'm down to 1, bring me 4 more." It was a very validating experience, whether it's your own memoir or somebody else's, the idea of writing a story.
Mhm.
Maria Rilke called that of poetry called it a momentary order. So
Mhm.
poetry is a momentary and I always appropriate that for memoir writing.
Mhm.
You write your memoir, you
Mhm.
create a momentary order out of your life. And, and I think for my mother, it was really she was really proud of it, that she had this book,
Mhm.
and I wrote it. She wasn't capable of writing it, and at
Mhm.
that point, she was in her, late 80s, so it was not really time to teach her how
Mhm.
to do it.
Right.
People come up to me and they say, "How did you know my mother? You've written her life." And so there's a resonance when she
Mhm.
hit the microcosm. I'm gonna say, well, I suppose that's patting myself on the back, but when you write the microcosm, you strike something in the macrocosm. So
Mhm.
that's the universal man woman.
Yeah.
People say there's no universal man. There is a universal woman and a universal man, and we recognize that inside of ourselves. And my mother's book, in many instances, really has caught that for people.
Mhm.
Um, my wife died in 2008, and I published her memoir. I had been gathering notes, and she had notes.
Mhm.
And so I her notes, her journals, I got her permission to extract from her journal and my own memories. Because when you live with somebody for 30 years,
Mhm.
you a lot of their stories because they told them to you, and
Mhm.
then you were someplace and they were telling them to a third person. It had a slight variety to it, and so you
Mhm.
got that nuance. And I was able to create her book
Mhm.
um, about her till the time she was 20. So that's the story that I have written. And then I wrote a book. That one is called A Sugary Frosting. And then I wrote a book about her last year of life. And she did a painting in which she said, "My eye fell into the soup in the dream." And she said, "The soup was my daily life, my sight, my insight. I was so caught up in my daily life that I didn't pay attention to what was happening." She had cancer and died at the end of that year. I called it my eye fell into the soup. And then subsequently, I published my own memoir, which is called French Boy.
Yeah.
And French Boy is me.
Mhm.
And we there's a whole community in Maine, about, say, 30 to 40% of the people in Maine
Mhm.
are Canadians of French, expression, because that was my first language.
Mhm.
Um, and so people would call us French Boy.
Mhm.
And it's an identity, a fuzzy identity because growing up, I never thought I was a French of France. I knew that I wasn't that, but I was
Mm.
French. And when I was gonna call the boy, I thought I should call it Canadian boy. I ran it around to people and they said, "No, that's not the right." We didn't call ourselves Canadians. So I ended up calling it French boy. I enjoyed writing the book. It was hard at times. It was a book that I think every memoir writer, all of us, when you arrive, I don't know if you're older than 18 perhaps or 12, you have some sorrow in your life.
Mhm.
And as you get older, I've already mentioned my wife's dying, and so that's
Mhm.
certainly harder than hard to live through. There are difficulties. In my childhood,
Mhm.
my parents, through no fault of their own, suffered a severe
Mhm.
financial collapse in their lives. Just, I, it wasn't that they were foolish or stupid or whatever, had nothing to do with them.
Mhm.
And they spent the 5 years putting their finances back together again,
Mhm.
and it influenced my childhood. That darkness I experienced during that time, my siblings did too, because I talked to them about it. As I would write about it, it was just too much. I
Mhm.
would stop writing. I would just stop. I would walk away. I would be nervous to revisit that time. My mother almost had a nervous breakdown. My father ended up working several jobs to try to get the finances together. It was a really grim time in my family, and I didn't want to visit. Who wants to visit that again?
Mm.
I knew that I couldn't write the book without that story. I'm working with one client who I worked with for a year before I found out that she had a sister. She said, "I can't stand her. I don't even want to put her in my memoir." Mm. Let's talk about this.
We established your expertise and you've written many memoirs and had thousands of people. Now we're going to take advantage of your knowledge and ask you questions about writing the memoirs. On your website, you talk about the 4 pillars of a memoir. What are those and why are they so important?
Every memoir, you have to have character, action, and setting. Those are the 3 legs of the stool of memoir writing, and they come from Robert Louis Stevenson, the Scottish writer.
Yes.
So in your memoir, you really have to focus. A memoir is, after all, literary writing. A literary writer really depends on character and who the character is, how the character responds, what the basis of the character's motivation is. When you write a memoir, you really have to go into the character and understand the character. When I wrote about my mother, I was struck by how there were 12 in her family, and she was the oldest.
Mhm.
And I was really struck by how she had a resentment of her father's authoritarianism. Her father was very severe and strict, and he had 12 kids, so you can understand that when you have 12 kids running around the house,
Mm.
you can't have them stay up all hours of the night. They have a bedtime, they go to bed. But it extended beyond that. My mother felt that her parents didn't understand her. This was very interesting for me as I listened to her tell her story. I extrapolated this, and then we began to speak about it. My mother said that my grandfather thought that her kids, me and my siblings, were spoiled.
Mhm.
And we were 6 kids. How could you spoil 6 kids? Yeah, but my mother used to say, "I want you to know you're not spoiled." She never said that in front of him, but she would
Mm.
always say it to us. And so that was that insight of what made my mother tick. And so that's character. And the next thing is action. Something has to happen
Mhm.
in your memoir. I'm not saying to make it up. Sometimes in my memoir workshops, people will make up an action.
Mhm.
And I will say to them, I have to say that as a Myers-Briggs, if Myers-Briggs or anybody listening to this knows Myers-Briggs, I am an INFP, and INFPs have an intuition, an extroverted intuition, in fact, and that means that we do pick up what is going on, and in my workshop, people would say, "How do you know this?" And I would say, "I actually don't know it. I'm just intuiting it. I'm sensing thing. I'm picking up
Mhm.
that an important characteristic." So I would say to all the memoir writers, whether you're writing your own memoir or somebody else's, really trust that as you're interviewing somebody and you're saying, "She's saying this, but something inside of me says what she's really feeling is here, not there."
Mhm.
Follow that. You have to be diplomatic because sometimes the other person is hiding it and doesn't want to admit it. That's a very fine line, but sometimes you can pick it up. I know that in my workshops, my mentality was, and I think if anybody listening to us is interested in doing workshops or coaching,
Mhm.
uh, you don't catch it. In coaching, for instance, people pay you good money. It's like going to a therapist. I've heard from my therapist friends when I've shared this, and they say there are always people who come and they lie to them. They
Mhm.
lie to the therapist. You say, "This is crazy. You're paying a lot of money." And they want to know if they can trust you.
Mm.
And once you pick up that they aren't being honest with you, then you can begin your work together. And I
Mm.
used to feel that in workshops, and I will feel it in coaching also, that
Mm.
um, when you make it clear that
Mm.
you have an insight about their situation, they know that what you're saying is probably true. That's important to trust, because if you can do that, your workshop and your coaching will be enormously better. Being nice or being discreet is not called for. So that's, anyways, I got back to character, but the action, you don't make the action up. You say, what happened?
Mm.
You describe it. Now, that doesn't say, that doesn't mean that you have suspense or foreshadowing. It's a good thing at the end of the chapter to say something like, my mother said this to me, and at the time I thought nothing of it, but it was to be more important than I thought at the time. Creating a suspense there. And foreshadowing is also very important. As you lay your story out, you go back. So I'm up to page 173, just say in my memoir. And then I realize on page 46, I ought to say something. Just say, Cindy is my best friend and she betrays me on page 173. But that can't be the first time we know that Cindy is your friend. We have to see you on page 46 and on page 98 and on page 120 that you're together. So that's your action. You're building your action. And as you build your action, you be sure to add things like, oh, I love that Cindy. I just can't imagine not being her friend. You don't lie, but you go back and you say, well, what did I feel about that? So that's your action. Sometimes people have said to me, the way you've written it just doesn't feel right. And they'll say, oh, no, this whole chapter 13 didn't exist. I just put it in because I thought it was more interesting. I would say to that client, I would say to anybody that I'm working with, I can work with you to create a autobiographical novel. If that's what you want to do, we can go for it. But if you want a memoir based on truth, autobiographical memoirs can leak. Which do you want to do? Almost everybody wants to do. I've had a few autobiographical memoirs in the years, but most people, like 95 or 98%, say, oh, I want it to be a memoir. So I say, let's explore why you fictionalized this aspect. So that's the action of a memoir. Very important. But there's no fiction there. And the same thing as in your character, there's no fiction.
So what about
The setting is the next cornerstone or the next leg of your stool. There are two settings. One is the physical setting, the building you grew up in, your school, your church, synagogue, temple, the physical things, the trees, the ocean, the river. There's another setting which is also very important, and that is your cultural setting, the intangible setting. So it could be your religion, your religious background. It could be your ethnic culture, your home culture, your mother and your father, how they interacted, and that created a culture of its own. I think that's the second aspect of setting, and we need to have both of those. If you grew up in a desert, not quite the same thing as if you grew up in northern Canada in the snow. We need to see that it's not enough to say, oh, I grew up in the Rocky Mountains or the Alps or the Andes. Don't say on page 17, I could see the Alps, I could see the Andes Mountains looking out my window.
Mm.
You tell us that on page 17, but on page 78, page 205, page 306, you repeat the view of the mountain, the peak. When a movie director creates a movie, he or she doesn't just pan the mountain once. We go back to the mountain, and we, as viewers, are reminded that there are mountains. And the same thing has to happen inside the
memoir?
setting. Yes. If, for instance, everybody in your family spoke another language, but the language of the country you're in, you can say it once. What does it mean to you? We have to have that experience to come back. Every element of a memoir has to be developed. But once developed, it has to be repeated to remind the reader what is what inside the memoir. Now we're going to the fourth element. I've talked about the three legs of the
Stool.
stool, but I should have said four legs because theme is the next one. Theme very frequently doesn't come to, sometimes it comes at the very beginning,
Mhm.
uh, but most likely it comes as you write. Certainly, the
Mhm.
nuancing of your theme
Mhm.
occurs as you write your story. One of the big differences between fiction and memoir writing is fiction, you start with some sort of theme. I want to express sorrow. I want to express
Mhm.
loneliness. Okay, there's going to be a woman, and she's sitting there and she's wringing her hands. Why is she doing that? She's doing that because her husband and she are not in accord. And then you develop your
Mm.
action from that feeling. At least that's the way I write fiction. I usually write it from some vision that I have, vision being
Mm.
that woman wringing her hands. Why is she doing this?
Mm.
A memoir, on the other hand,
Mhm.
got your grandmother, your mother, your brother, your sister.
Mm.
These are your characters. You've got your action. And my action, for instance, my parents' financial difficulties. So that's there. The
Mm.
setting is my cultural setting, my physical setting. So what did all of this add up to? And as I'm writing, I became very aware that I wanted to depict my family's working class background and
Mhm.
what that meant for me.
Mhm.
I wanted to describe the role of religion in my life, and I knew I was gonna write about those things. As I wrote about them, they became determinant factors in the
Mm.
writing. I evolved 3 major
Mm.
themes: language, religion,
Mm.
and the working class. As I developed them, especially the language part, I became aware of otherness. We all are aware of a certain otherness. People will say, "Oh, I'm just nothing like my brother and my sister." Uh, That's otherness. And
Mhm.
sometimes the otherness is huge. It can be because we have a physical handicap, and that creates a huge otherness. It can be racial, it can be gender, it can be sexual preference, whatever it is. All of us have some sense of otherness. How
Mm.
did that develop? What was the meaning of that? Did that otherness bring you down, or did that otherness, was that something that you began to prize and moved on in your life, cherishing that otherness, but not letting it be an impediment, not letting it be something that causes you to stumble?
Mm.
And so that was an I enjoyed that part. That's the larger picture, the themes. Otherness was played in religion didn't so much bring out the otherness. Language did. And
Mm.
the working class brought a lot of otherness with my parents from very early on.
Mm.
I knew that I was not going to be a working class man. I knew that I wasn't going to be somebody who worked with his hands. My grandparents worked in the mills. I just knew it wasn't going to happen to me.
Mhm.
And so then you look around and you say, okay, who is going to be I want to be someday? I found that in books. I found in books mentors for
Mm.
me.
Mm.
And so that made school a really important activity for me because school was like opening windows, opening doors that I knew that I would have to pass through. Both of my parents did not graduate from high school. They went to their 10th and 11th grades and then they left school. But as young as 8 years old, I knew I was going to college.
Mm.
In my memoir,
Mm.
this was otherness again.
Mm.
Some part of me was embarrassed. I don't know if
Mm.
I would say I was ashamed, but I didn't want to speak about it. I felt like I was abandoning my parents, that I was letting them down. And I wanted to be loyal to them because that's important to me. So I wanted to be loyal to them. But at the same time, I knew they weren't models for me. I knew their experience was not the experience that I was going to follow. I live about a mile from where I grew up. Around the corner, there lived a man who was a writer,
Mm,
and he had quite a number of books.
mm,
Not that I got to know him well. I hardly knew him, but I knew his reputation.
mm,
He became for me a model that I knew somebody had done it,
mm.
somebody had done it nearby, so I could do it also.
What is the first step someone should take when they decide to write their memoir?
They should start writing. I'm not being flippant, but
Y-
just start writing. Every one of us has stories, vignettes. They're not
But
the whole story.
don't you recommend that they at least make a list of the things they want to write about?
Well,
They might.
let's put them at the same place. So some people will start here, some people will start there, and they're both fine. One way that I recommend to a lot of people would come to the workshops, or even people who come to coaching, and sometimes they say, I don't know what to write about. I know I want to write something, I don't know what to write. For those people, I recommend the memory list, what I call the memory list of everything
Mhm,
that you remember about either a period of your life or your
mhm,
entire.
mhm,
When I did one,
mhm,
I did 8 pages of my entire life.
mm,
This is for my next book, which
mhm,
is called My 19th Century Life. This is my high school years. So all
mhm,
kinds of stuff. It can be big, it can be small. It can be my
mhm,
mother died when I was 8 years old, or it can be small, like I had a stagecoach on my wallpaper when I
mhm,
was a young boy.
mhm,
I mean, it can be anything in between. I recommend that you have to put at least 3 to 5 words.
mhm,
So don't write hat. You won't remember that in 3 months or 2 months. Write Aunt Bee's feather hat, and that you will remember. So 3 to 5 words usually fixes a memory.
mhm,
Uh, for a memory list, you can't say, "This is not important enough."
mhm,
No, just put it down, keep
mhm,
at it. Important, seemingly, unimportant, put it down.
mhm,
What will happen is the seemingly unimportant, the stagecoach on the wallpaper in my
mhm,
room
mhm,
will become a setting.
mhm,
So as you're describing your room, and there I lay in my room, my eyes just bawling out, and I looked up and there was a stagecoach, and I said, "I hate that stagecoach. I never liked that wallpaper." So we're getting characterization, but you
mhm,
never know what it will add up to. So
mhm,
don't say it's unimportant because it could be a nice little detail that
mhm,
fixes the setting for the reader.
mhm,
So that's the memory list. And then the memory list, you look at it as you're writing, and sometimes you use it to refresh your memory. There's also what I have called the extensive memory list, but there's also a shorter memory list that I ask people sometimes to do, and that's called the cluster memory list. Look at your life
mhm,
and go through 10 scenes, 10
mhm,
vignettes, 10 events that you
mhm,
say, if I were to die in 2 months,
mm,
what which 10 stories do I really want to have written, say, for my kids? I will say to people, start to write from those because you have the most energy
mm,
with
mm,
those stories. When you've done those, and generally after you've written a while,
mhm,
I've asked people to do what I've called the life energy list. And each one of our lives, we have phases. So you might say, and then this, for instance, just say a marriage phase.
mhm,
And you say, there was this phase when I was just dating a lot. If you're a girl, you say, I was dating a lot of boys, men.
mhm,
And then you meet your husband. So it fits into meeting a lot of boys,
mhm,
but it begins to be serious. And then you have the marriage phase, and
mhm,
then you might have the disenchantment phase. And so there are things that are grouped together, and then there's things that have fallen apart. Sometimes they're short, sometimes they're long. Like when I did an energy phase, certainly my 4 years of high school was one energy phase. And then my college phase is really quite different. The energy that I had as a person was quite different. So that's an energy phase. And then I went 7 years with the same energy. At 30, I had another 3-year phase. And what this does is it organizes your chapters. These very frequently become your chapters. And so sometimes people, how will I break it up? Energy phases.
Okay. So also each energy phase could be a memoir of its own because a memoir
Yes.
doesn't have to include your whole life. That's mostly biography. But a memoir
Yeah.
is usually a snippet of your life with a special focus on a theme from which people can take lessons for themselves. I really like this one, the energy phases. So, to summarize what you just said, the three ways one was to create a memory list, second was to summarize it in 5, 8 pages, what you want to write about, and third is to look for the energy phases,
Mm.
what energy phases you want to cover in that period. That's good. That's a really good
Oh,
step.
I would also say for the memory list, I forgot to mention this, is change line every time you change idea. And
Mm-hmm.
that way, visually, it's very easy to pick up. But if every time you have a new memory, you have a new line, they don't need to come in order. You just put them as they come to you. Later on, you might want to organize them. But we've got two activities. One activity is just to go into the unconscious and pull out as much as you can. And the job of the unconscious is
Mm-hmm.
not to be conscious, it's to keep unconscious. So if
Mm-hmm.
it's pulled up, then you're almost fooling the unconscious. If you do it this way, when I would do the workshops, I used to do residential workshops. That is, people would show up and we would spend a week together.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say the first night we met on Sunday, and we would have a session, and then they would go to their rooms, and I would say, tomorrow, I expect you to come back with 200 memory list items. And I can never do that.
Mm.
And I said, give it a try. And then the next day they would come and they'd say, oh, you kept me up until 3 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't go to sleep. And I've got 500 items. Try it. Whoever's listening to this, viewing
Yeah.
this, it just works.
That actually answers my next question. I was going to ask you, what do people do if they get stuck?
They always say, I can't do this. Yeah, probably you could do it, but I can't do it. I would, I'll just start it. Just give it a try. And it does work.
Another thing which stops many people is to write about someone in their lives. Let's call it a toxic person. They don't want to talk about it, but without that, their memoir is incomplete. And that person is alive, you don't want to offend them, and mostly it's a family member. So, how can you address that kind of issue, problem?
I just had Yeah. a woman who was dealing with her mother, and her solution was she couldn't publish her memoir until her mother died. Actually, her mother died last January, so she was ready to publish her memoir.
Mhm.
But her mother was very toxic in
Mm.
her life
Mm.
and has portrayed her mother as people on the outside said, "Oh, don't you have a lovely mother?"
Mm.
And on the inside, this woman felt her mother was just very controlling and very demeaning, and
Mm.
um, so it was really very hard. She had made the decision to write the best memoir she could
Mm.
and not publish it until her mother died. I really don't know the answer to that. It depends on what level of struggle you have with the other people. Sometimes people who disagree. Dad was a drunk. No, dad just liked to drink a bit. Uh, and I've had people write their version and share it with other people. If the conflict is light enough, that might resolve it, to say you write your memoir the way you want it. This particular woman who was writing about her mother has a sister
Mhm.
who does not disagree with her at all about her portrayal of her mother.
Mhm.
She only says, "You can't make this public."
Yeah.
And she says, "Oh, everybody will know." And
Mm.
it's about everybody know this is my family. I don't want them to know I had this terrible family. And my client said she has a different last name than my mother. She has a different last name than me.
Yeah.
He tells somebody who's going to know. But
Yeah.
the question you posit is a very difficult one. For some people, if there was sexual abuse and somebody says, "I must tell the story," in which case you probably are accepting that will be a rupture of your
Yeah.
family.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those are value judgments that the writer must make. I can't decide that, I'm just
Yeah.
giving a lot of examples. It is very difficult.
Mm.
I know my story when I published my memoir and my mother's memoir, my siblings saw them and they gave me their feedback, but there was no hard, "What? You can't say this. This is crazy." There was none of that whatsoever. It's an occasion to write a memoir. It's an occasion to create order out of your life. And
Mm.
if writing your memoir, I'm
Yeah.
just going to throw this out, if writing your memoir perpetuates the disorder,
Yeah.
it solidifies the disorder, I would say you're not doing yourself a service. On the other hand, writing a memoir is not the occasion to throw stones at somebody.
Yeah. I think it comes to the value judgment. What do you value more? A memoir or a relationship? So if the person is still alive in your life and you don't want to sour the relationship any further than it already is, you probably would not attempt to do that in your memoir. Maybe you can write it later on or write a second memoir about that. But I don't think it is something you would want to do to expose a person or their toxic nature while they're still in your
I
life.
agree with you, and I also have an addendum that I think it's perfectly fine to write a memoir for yourself and perhaps publish it later, 10 years later, when that person is gone. So many people have come to me, especially in the workshop people, and they would say, "This is just as good as going to a therapist. It
Mm.
costs a lot less, and in the end, you have a book."
Yes.
Um, and so
Yes.
I would put that forward, that writing a memoir, and nobody can write a memoir
Mhm.
without having some sort of therapeutic effect
Mm.
on you. It's just cleansing to write a memoir.
That's a very good point. And there is one question I've been dying to ask you, which is to take you on the lighter side of memoir writing. You mentioned that you have written a book and you also coach writing memoirs from photographs. Tell us about that. How to do that?
Well, so it's in the captions. The book was written in the '90s, so it's a little today, we didn't have the computer technology, and at the time, it was to take your scrapbooks
Mhm.
and to take your photos and to write captions that are meaningful, and sometimes, instead of just captions, people would write longer. You could even write a page that you would insert in your photo album. It was really to add to the popular practice of having a birthday cake, a birthday party for your child, and you write "Yum, yum, good" beneath the picture of the cake.
Mm,
Okay,
mm,
where do you go with that? But if you wanted to write a story, you might say, "And it was at this day that I loved my son, and I realized I was pregnant, and I didn't want to be pregnant again."
You-
You could write something that captures a vacation, for instance. This is a memorable vacation. The
Mhm.
boys, girls loved this so much, but it was at this vacation that I realized that my husband and I were not in accord. So
Mm.
you can write whatever you want to write, of course, how much you want to reveal, because an album is much more private than a memoir.
These days, I think this is the thing people are looking for because they take hundreds and thousands of photos while they're on holidays or someone has a grandchild or a child. And you take a photo and you can write very fluently about that photo or that moment captured in that photo. And that makes it very good memoir. You're not looking for a theme or a structure. You're taking a bunch of photos and you're writing about it and all the memories it captures. I did similar thing with my memoir, and I did it on Substack. I couldn't find a way to tell the little stories I had with my life, so I picked up 100 objects. I started with 20, and then others kept coming. And I wrote the stories those objects reminded me from my early life. And that's how I went the whole way. It brought so many memories back. I was simply explaining, taking the cue from the photo or a object or a handkerchief or a tapestry I have done, things like that.
Yes, that is the idea, and I think it appeals to somebody who, as you say, does not want to go to the whole length of looking for
Yeah.
sustaining a character and creating a setting and developing the theme.
Hmm.
It's a very accessible format for somebody who wants to preserve some of the story. And obviously, you do have to be just like you were, you do have to be selective. Yes, that is a problem that we have with our phones. We take 20 pictures of the
Hmm.
setting sun, and you say, "Okay, how many pictures do you need of the setting sun or the baby crawling or something?" So you would have to select and then organize and then write something that encapsulates that feeling. The pictures to see the baby's round cheeks and all that is wonderful. And yet there's something more that I realize. For instance, you might say, realize how much I loved being a mother, a father. Finally, I felt like I had settled into my life when I saw my little girl, my little boy. So you can reveal some of yourself and really get away from that picture the cake and say, "Yeah, I'm good," which is nothing. 10 years from now, when you read that, you say, "Why did I waste the opportunity with such phrases?"
Oh, this has been great session, Danae. I learned a lot. My audience will learn a lot when this podcast go up. The most important question now is, where can people find you and your books?
Amazon, whatever country the viewer is in. If you're not in the United States, that's a really good place. They're available through Barnes& and Noble, draft to digital. My own website is the Memoir Network. So it's the Memoir Network, so network of helping people to write memoirs.com. And we have many there. We have many electronic books. In fact, all our books are available electronically. It's always a real pleasure to know that people, places I've never been to, probably will never go to, but that I am there in some way
Mhm.
in a book. It's the pleasure of being a writer and communicating. I invite people to come to turningmemories.com, and I'm also on Substack, which is where we met. I have articles there.
Thank you very much, Danae. Hopefully, people will find this session very informative and help them write their memoirs because we are planning to write a book in November, in 1 month. There are many people taking that challenge. So hopefully this will be helpful session for them. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And to all the viewers, just sit down and start writing. Don't talk about it.
There you go.
Bye.